Thomas and I met in London probably 20-something years ago when he was attached to the Institute of Education there. And it's over this last period that he has made a study which we're going to be talking about tonight, which he's going to talk about tonight, on history, transpersonal history and the future of peace in the Middle East. I just want to make a couple of remarks myself by way of introduction, and then I'll say something about Thomas's work. The first is that one of the writers that he refers to here is Peter Sorokin. He's not very well known. I don't know whether any of you, apart from Thomas, has read any Sorokin. Any hands go up? No? Well, he was a contemporary of Arnold Toynbee, 1889 to 1968. And he had the distinction of being condemned to death by both the Bolsheviks and the other side. And in his autobiography, he describes the period that he spent as a prisoner condemned to death, and it's an extraordinary account. And one of the things that he writes about from that, and it's actually in a book that amazingly is not in your 200-page bibliography, there can't be many that are missing. It's called The Ways and Power of Love, which is an extraordinary book. Published by him in the late 1950s. It was some research he did at Harvard, funded by Eli Lilly. And right at the beginning of that book, he explains this period that he had and his fundamental conviction that he came to, which really was expressed in the work for the rest of his life, that the means of violence could never, in the end, bring about peace. That if there was going to be a lasting peace, then the means of bringing about peace had to be love and compassion and openness and understanding and so on. And this became an absolute conviction in the rest of his work. He eventually founded the sociology department at Harvard, so he became the first professor of sociology at Harvard. And the book that I know best by him is the Social and Cultural Dynamics, which is a 4-volume work. It's not even in the University Library in St Andrews. In fact, there's no Sorokin in the University Library at all, which is a disgrace. But the book that I know, which I can recommend to you if you're interested in history of civilizations, is The Crisis of Our Age, which is a summary of the social and cultural dynamics, published by One World about 10 years ago. It's absolutely fascinating. Especially in view of the development of our own culture, the balance between the materialistic and the material and the spiritual side of life. So that was the remark about Sorokin. My second remark is one that refers to the work of Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I don't know how many of you have read his book, No Future Without Forgiveness. But it's a very powerful book. And again, this seems to me to point forwards to a time when you can break the vicious cycles which perpetuate the kind of conflicts that we see around the world, particularly ethnic conflicts. And the interesting thing was an episode where he goes to Israel and he suggests very modestly that maybe a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the Middle East would be a good idea, and he gets a very frosty reception. This is not thought to be a good idea by the people he's talking to at all. But if you think in terms of the evolution of culture, then we have to be going towards a more non-violent way of solving our problems, a less confrontational way, and putting ourselves in the position of other people in empathic civilization, as Jeremy Rifkin argues in his recent work. So those are my two remarks. So coming to Thomas's work, what you've got over here is a table full of his books and musings. Some of them are directly related to tonight. So, for instance, we have his doctoral thesis here, Towards a Transpersonal History of the Search for Peace, 1945 to 2001. 200 pages of bibliography in here. And he wrote so much that he had to spill over into other volumes. So there's another one here called Biographical Encyclopedia A to Z of Transpersonal Theorists, Historians, Psychologists and Philosophers. And this is an amazing work just on its own. And I noticed you've got something from Rupert Sheldrake where Sir Paul Nurse accuses him of fabricating.
Did you spot that? Yeah.
Yes, I think it's outrageous.
What? Nurse's allegation?
Oh, it's outrageous.
Well, I couldn't agree more, but he did say it to my face, so I'd like to mediate this one.
Well, I don't.
I mean, if Nurse is going around saying that, he should be stopped.
I don't think he's got any evidence to say. It's just he doesn't agree with what Sheldrake is saying.
Well,
so
we should mediate it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I'm on Sheldrake's side.
I know.
But Nurse is the president of the Royal Society. So
I know. Well, you can misuse your authority and prestige. And that's what other scientists have done in relation to ESP.
Yeah, well, that's got to stop. That's what this doctoral thesis is about, is getting more credibility in the orthodox scientific community for transpersonal thought.
Okay.
Anyway,
Yes, I'll just quickly finish this off here. This is his autobiography, Musings, 2000 to 2008. And this book's a very interesting book called Enlightenments, which is a comparative treatment of enlightenment across different religious traditions, which you said you didn't think anybody had done it, and I don't think anybody had done it, so I think this is definitely a book I should review. It's generally available. So I think Thomas lives in Argyll, quite close to Ardkingless, I think, which was designed by my grandfather, Sir Robert Lorimer. And he said it rains over there all the time. And occasionally he comes out and gives talks. And so I think we're extremely fortunate that Neil has winkled him out of his retreat to come and talk to us this evening, because I think what he's going to say will be quite fascinating and significant.
Just a very brief introduction. For those of you that haven't met me before or haven't heard of my work, I've kept it fairly low profile deliberately, but I've been very busy doing stuff, as it were, behind the scenes for peace and spiritual reconciliation of different faiths and different paths. I was born in Canada in 1956, and my mother and father lived in Montreal for 10 years. My mother just died at age 98 on January the 13th, Friday the 13th, this year. And she was a lifelong peace activist, and her particular thing was ridding the world of nuclear weapons. Now, I was brought up going to CND marches and being involved with that whole movement. But I always took the view that if we're going to rid the world of nuclear weapons, which is a wonderful project I'm still pledged to, we have to get rid of the causes of them. They're just the outer facade. The weapons are there because of some problem in our spirituality or our mentality or our society. So I then studied at Bristol University reading philosophy, rebelled against the arid academic sort of mono focus of the thing. It was all in monochrome, it was all AJR, and metaphysics doesn't exist. I already knew I wanted to be a metaphysician, so I resigned in protest and went to Canada for 4 years and studied independently at the University of Calgary and read the world's great spiritual texts. I had to do that, under my own auspices. That's the first time I read the Quran, the Bible, the Vedas, the Buddhist scriptures, the sutras, as an independent scholar, effectively. And came to the conclusion in about 1981 that the world's great faiths were all interlinked, and that they can be rationally comprehended, that the unity is not only a mystical unity, it's also scientifically provable, effectively, with the advances of modern psychology and modern science. But the problem of academia is everybody's working in their own separate little field of knowledge. So the biologist does that, the chemist does that, the physicist does that, the sociologist just does that, the psychologist and so on. Because I got outside of formal academia, but was like a kind of Trojan horse inside academia, going around, learning from all of them, I could see the bigger picture. Anyway, fast forward, I went back to London from Canada and studied for a modern history degree. Because I'd come to the view I'd done enough philosophy now, 6 years, 7 years of in-depth study. And I wanted to study how the world got into the chaos it's in, through its international, conflicts and so on. So I did an in-depth study at the University of London on the history of the last 200 years, including the Cold War. And during this time, I was elected coordinator of philosophers for peace around the globe at a conference in Moscow, dealing with peacemaking between East and West. Right? Now, that was a huge sort of position of responsibility. It made me responsible for the voice of philosophers globally on peace issues. That was the time when we met, when I was also working at the University of London to create an Institute of Peace Studies, which is now autonomous. It's now based in a castle in Argyll. And it took me to about 33 countries, travelling around the world, meeting intellectuals, philosophers, historians, academics, and some policymakers. I spoke twice at the UN headquarters in New York about the role of universities in peace. And I went to the World Social Summit in Copenhagen in about 1995, which was the first of these big UN conferences with world leaders. And I realised these world leaders cannot save the planet, basically. They haven't got a clue what to do. Because they're in power for such a short time, they're always watching their backs, right? Everything they say is fought and barred according to like who's listening, who's asked the question, what's on the agenda, and when's the next election coming up. You will not get truth from these guys. I realised that with horror. Listening to them, literally. And so as a mere philosopher, I have nothing to lose, It's like, thank God, I'm not a politician. I'm not interested in outer power. What I'm interested in is spiritual wisdom and the sources of good statesmanship and custodiing this planet into a world of peace. So the projects I've been working on for the last 10 years are long-term projects. They're not in the media. You won't hear about them. This is one of the few places They're there for the next 100 years, maybe the next 1,000 years. Okay. And the thesis I worked on is similarly scaled. It's it's a future-oriented thing. And one of the things that led me to do was to visit the Middle East in the last few years, 2008, 1999. And I've been very interested in the Israeli-Palestinian problems and the Iraq War. In 2003, I was one of those million people marching in London saying, Mr. Blair, this is not a good idea to invade Iraq. We were totally ignored, and the British government has poured millions of pounds of taxpayers' money into occupying Basra, which actually we probably have quite good relations with anyway, and supporting America's project, which has spent trillions of dollars in the Middle East. And I watched in horror, and so I've been working away behind the scenes trying to work out, A, why on earth this happened? B, how could we be so stupid? C, isn't there another way to solve these problems than militarism? And if so, what is it? Right. And that's the what is it, how we can solve these problems that I'm now speaking about tonight. And this is based, as you heard, on about 20, 30 years of intense study and reflection, and action and activism, and meeting and traveling. I'm a historian in the tradition of Herodotus. Herodotus, the original founder of history, used to travel and meet people and ask questions. I love that guy. I've been doing the same, And so I'm just doing a report. So, okay, the first thing I want to talk about is what is transpersonal history? That was the introduction. If you've got any other questions, we can talk later in the questions. Transpersonal history, the first thing I want to talk about. As David said, it's maybe a new thing for some people, but to me it's just so obvious. I haven't got a clue why nobody else has thought of it before. No academic anywhere in the system seems to have ever put those words together. I did a history degree at London University, which is one of the most important centres for historical research in Britain and in the world. It's a thing called the Institute of Historical Research. They have all these wonderful archives and endless libraries full of learned journals and papers. I did a paper in diplomatic history at the LSE with some of the world's greatest diplomatic historians, history of political ideas with some of those thinkers, because it's the history of ideas that's always interested me, obviously. And history of religions comes in a lot too, because I read European history from 1500 to now in enormous detail. And fascinating stuff. But the basic paradigm that historians are working from is a largely materialist paradigm. And I suppose the quintessential sort of exponent of this was Marx, Engels, historical materialism, it was called, in the 19th century. And you know, the previous generation to me, the avant-garde were often Marxists because it was very chic, it was thought to be scientific. So what historians do is they study the historical conditions of ordinary people, that's us, in our historical interactions, in our material interactions. So our labour, our work, our economic exchanges, you know, our physical activities and so on. And that's become a fine art. A lot of history is conducted in terms of social history, class history, you know, the history of the labour struggles of Glasgow, the Red Clyde, class conflicts in Scotland. You can see learned journals writing about Scottish history, John Knox, and the class struggles of 16th century Scotland. You know, it's an industry. Right? But what historians don't do is comment on the kind of metaphysical angle, what's going on at any deeper level. They tend to look at the material events as being the real story. Now, if we had time, I'd ask you at this point to spend a couple of minutes reflecting on your life to this point. Let's just do a little exercise, okay, just for 1 minute. Just look back over your own personal history as a human being and think about its material history. But then I'm going to just ask you, is there anything else there? Close your eyes and reflect. How did you get to this church tonight? Where have you come from over the whole history of your life up to this point? Time we could do longer, and I'd love it if you could do it in pairs and discuss that. I'm a teacher, by the way, as well. I'm a trained educationist, work a lot with group work and stuff. We don't have time for that, sadly, but imagine sharing that with your neighbour, or you can go back afterwards and do that. I would put it to you that our history is also the history of our inner strivings, our emotions, our fears, our anxieties, our longings, our loves, our love affairs, our highest aspirations, and our thoughts, and our consciousness. You know, our history is all of that, as well as our physical bodies, where we've lived. I mean, that's almost incidental. It's important, you know, what job we do to earn a living, to get money. You know, that's not the real history, is it? It's our spiritual life, to sum it up in a word. And I think that's true for all of us. And yet, so why is it historians have neglected that dimension? I find it bizarre. Well, anyway, look, thank God, there is a new field of psychology that has come forward and said, no, that inner story is the real story of the psyche. Psychology is the place we look for discourse about the nature of the soul. And fortunately, psychology has stepped up to the plate and done its work over the last decades. And a whole new discipline has come into being called transpersonal psychology. Now, the phrase was coined by Jung at the time of his parting company with Freud, because Jung believed, unlike Freud's largely materialist view of human nature and the human psyche, Freud thought that our feelings, thoughts and emotions are the product of our biological and chemical processes going on in our nervous systems, which are largely governed by our sexual libido and its frustration, or whatever. And all the great works of art, culture, religion are just sort of epiphenomenon from that fundamental primal drive. Jung said, no, that can't be the case. Come on, the great mystics, the great poets, the Dantes, the Shakespeare, they're not just neurotics, you know. There's some other side to human nature here, the great spiritual visionaries of the planet. And we have to have a way of studying that scientifically. So he came up with the theory, as you probably know, of archetypes. He said, look, people tend to experience that immense void of spiritual experience according to certain forms or patterns that recur across religious and cultural and racial boundaries and historical boundaries. You know, the archetypes, as you call them, recur in history. So the archetype of the great mother, the goddess, recurs in every culture and civilization. And you know, the myth of the hero who has to leave the mother to then go off and adventure and accomplish something, and then come back and return and share it, you know, with the community, is the Buddhist story. That's an archetypal myth that's in all civilizations and cultures. So Jung began the study of transpersonal psychology, and he died, you know, back in not long after the war. He was asked, interestingly enough, by UNESCO. Yeah, he was asked by UNESCO at the end of World War II, what was his recipe for preventing World War III? What was his contribution to ending war? And he put forward a detailed report, which I've indexed in my thesis. And he said basically, the problem is mass movements of thought. Sort of the isms, the fascisms, the communisms, the kind of, you know, the isms that take away your independence of thought. And the solution is our individuality awakening, our personal enlightenment, which he called individuation, when we find the self, which is the kind of the imageless image from which all the archetypes emanate. Okay. Now anyway, so, but since, you know, there have been other great transpersonal thinkers, and I'll just mention a few. Abraham Maslow was a Jewish visionary psychologist who wrote a book called The Psychology of Being. He talked about meta-values. He's famous for this hierarchy of needs. He said, the highest need we all have is for metaphysical meaning, to feel our life matters and is worth something. Right? It's, yeah, we need bread on the table and water in the jar, but we need meaning first. And Assagioli is another great transpersonal psychologist, coined the word psychosynthesis, arguing that psychoanalysis breaks up the psyche. The point of the whole story of our lives is to put it all back together again and reach integration, which is samadhi. Interestingly, in Sanskrit, samadhi means to make everything the same, doing the sameness. And then Ken Wilber's probably one of the most famous contemporary transpersonal theorists in America, who's put a wonderful intellectual commitment, actually, many years into working on what he calls integral theory, how everything connects and coheres. But really, he's doing transpersonal theory. So his work is again crucial. Now, all these thinkers, what I'm arguing, and the thing about most of them is they're not trained historians. I mean, it's very difficult to be both a transpersonal psychologist and a trained historian. They're both disciplines. You know, it would take a lifetime or several lifetimes to master the discourse you need for both fields. I'm saying we have to speed up a bit our knowledge of what is possible. I'm very interested in gifted and talented education. In my work as a teacher, I've worked with gifted and talented kids. I think we have to speed up the planet's intelligentsia. And as, you know, organising philosophers of peace, I'm a bit disappointed at the slow speed we're all working on, with all due respect. Thank God for people like this group that, you know, are aware of that. So what I'm saying is we have to link the findings of transpersonal psychology, which is sometimes called noetic sciences. Edgar Mitchell set up the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. These are people scientifically researching parapsychology, near-death experience, like your International Association of Near-Death Studies. You know, empirically proving that the soul transcends the physical body and survives death, right? With a number of cases. Peter Fenwick, a great thinker, has pioneered this stuff as a neuropsychiatrist at the University of London. And he gave a talk for my grammar school in Dorset a while ago. You know, there's thousands of cases of empirically verifiable examples of people returning from a near-death experience with reports of you know, an altered state existence, disembodied existence. So, if that's all true, as I'm arguing transpersonal psychology demonstrates, what are the implications for history? That's what transpersonal history starts by asking, right? The implications are vast. What it means is that the great mystics and religious visions of the past, like Christ, like Buddha, like Muhammad, like Krishna, like Merlin, like whoever, or whoever Merlin might be, were not crazy, were not, you know, neurotics who were having a bad day. They were people accessing these transpersonal experiences. And there's a history of it. The great Sufis of the planet, you know, thousands of these wonderful mystics, Ibn Arabi and all the gang, were having genuine experiences. And if you look back at the literature, What are they doing? They're having sort of precognitive dreams. They're having telepathic experiences, often with their teachers or students. And that's reported across religions. You get great Buddhist saints in their life stories, like Yeshe Tsogye, the consort of Padmasambhava, who brought Tantrism to Tibet. It's transpersonal phenomena being reported. Right? So the first thing transpersonal historians can do is look back at all that rich literature, including, by the way, St. Columba. I was on Iona last year. He's our local saint on the blog. And the biography of St. Columba by Augustine is full of transpersonal reports. Columba was always having precognitive experiences and telepathic encounters and just wonderful visionary adventures. There's one time he was out there sitting on the hill on Iona. One of his student disciples followed him at night and lo and behold saw him talking to angels. And Columba swore him to silence. He mustn't talk about this. And it was only after his death that he confessed what he'd seen. Well, what does that mean, Clough talking to angels? It's reported in the literature that there are sort of, let's say, beings from other planes, other dimensions that can intercommunicate with us humans. Why should we think so arrogantly we're the only ones that have a monopoly of consciousness or intelligence? The literature of esoteric writings throughout the planet's history seems to indicate we share this world with other beings, transdimensional beings. Whether we call them angels or gods or deities or kami, as the Japanese do. You know, we can sit down and have a philosophical debate about that. Plotinus said they're all elements of the one divine mind, just as we are. They just happen to be not in the body. You know, they're in some other realm, some etheric realm. And theosophists and so on can talk about that too. Anyway, that's all very interesting. And so transpersonal historians have got a duty to look back at all that and look at it scientifically and through the lens of contemporary research in transpersonal psychology. Okay, now what's this got to do with the Middle East? That's all very interesting, you know. And I think there is a centre in Edinburgh University that does parapsychology still, so they're sort of doing that. I don't think they've shut it down.
No, there's no longer a chair. So they've tried to sideline it, basically.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise.
Well, we'll have to change that now in Scotland. Anyway, it's got an enormous amount to do with the Middle East, right? What I want to now go on, the second point I'm exploring here, is that, you see, the Middle East is the battleground of the religions of mankind. These great metaphysical systems, known to us as Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, the Baha'i religion, you know, it's the epicenter in which these have all come out. And so the problematic of the Middle East, if we're talking about peacemaking in the Middle East, we can't avoid the religious dimension and the historical impact that's had. So I've spent years, I'm sure people here have in this room, studying the history of these two religions, their origins. I've travelled to Galilee, I've sat on the hill where Jesus gave his Sermon on the Mount, and gone to Banyas where he gave that wonderful secret discussion with his disciples about who do you actually think I am? You know? And St. Thomas is the one that answers correctly, in my opinion, if you read his gospel. So trying to reconstruct what actually happened. Transpersonal history can help by actually, if you get a trans-dimensional fix on the events of history, right, from its different sources, you don't just use the text material. In the 19th century, von Ranke in Germany thought scientific history was about looking at archival material and researching, you know, the documents. Now that's fantastic. Yes, the documents, please. More documents. I love them. I've got a castle full of documents. Right? But they're not enough, because the documents are written by people with consciousness. And there's an oral history behind the documents. Transpersonal history has to research the oral history. Right? So who actually wrote the Gospels? For what end? For what purpose? What visionary experiences led up to them doing that? There's a transpersonal history of St. Paul, Luke, Matthew, Mark, John. You know, who was actually behind all this stuff? And the story of Jesus can be reconstructed using transpersonal history more authentically, because it's not wedded exclusively to the documents and takes the claims of transpersonal experiences seriously. So we can then ask, for instance, what happened at Pentecost? They're all in a room. Something strange is going on. You know, and they're beginning to see each other's auras. There's a light around their bodies. They say it's like a flame on the head, as the Holy Spirit descends. You know, what is that? I can report objectively. I was once in a Quaker meeting in Canada, deeper meditation, and I saw this incredible aura around just this random Quaker who'd actually come from Cambridge. You know, and it was just shining so bright. I think that's what they're talking about. I think it's when the spiritual world impacts on the material world in such a sort of convincing way. Anyway, now we have to do the same with Islam and the other great religions. If you look at, say, the birth of Islam and Muhammad, and I'm doing a commentary on the Quran at the moment, which has taken over a year. It's a huge undertaking. I feel I need to do this because I love the Quran and know it well. I've taught Islamic studies for many years. I worked with Dr. Zaki Badawi in London, who's a very great Islamic scholar. And I've met many Sufis that have been initiated into Sufi traditions over the years, so I have a lot of the time for them. And there's such a problematic going on in the Middle East about what is Islam and how do we interpret it. There's the kind of Al-Qaeda interpretation, which this group in Nigeria seemed to be reading from, which has just slaughtered and killed a couple of hostages yesterday, it was announced. You know, which is a very different reading to what I think was Muhammad's intention, or the intention of authentic Islam. But in order to be able to say that, one has to actually demonstrate it from the Quran, because the same text can be misused. So what I've been doing is going over the Quran in great detail, Arabic and English, and trying to come to its innermost essence. This is supposed to be a teaching of peace. Right? Islam is peace, surrender, submission. And I would say it's part of the solution to the problems of the Middle East, if that could be recovered. But what I'm arguing is that we need a transpersonal history to begin to be able to do that. Okay, we have to begin to try and understand what Muhammad was doing when he was channeling and receiving these inspirations, scientifically. It's not that either, you know, European historians of the Enlightenment dismissed Muhammad as a charlatan and misguided, you know, because from their materialist perspective, these things are false, therefore he must have been. But from a transpersonal perspective, I think we can have a much more intelligent response and say, no, Muhammad was an amazing guy. He seemed to be a man of great integrity who had these experiences, which follow a sort of common pattern and a theme, and they can be analysed. What I'm doing is going through them chronologically. The order of the Quran is not chronological. So I'm doing the commentary in the chronological sequence tied into his life story. And there is a pattern. So the same thing needs to be done with Judaism, which again is an awesome religion. And you know, I've been studying the Kabbalah for many, many years, since like the early 80s, when I first really encountered it. It's not taught in schools. Nobody ever told me about the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah means receivings, transmissions. It's very interesting. It's a Hebrew word related to the word Qibla. Qibla is the direction you face in a mosque, which is where Mecca is. The Qibla is the facing point. The Kabbalah is how you get to ultimate truth. And it's a very complicated esoteric system embedded within Judaism, which is about the metaphysics of existence, a multi-level being. And so when Moses encounters the burning bush, and God speaks about the burning bush, I think what he's having, from a transpersonal historical perspective, is a kind of experience of those multidimensional levels of being. He's encountering the complexity of God. Right? So, and many rabbis have studied and taught the Kabbalah. I mean, you can't really qualify properly as a rabbi in Judaism unless you understand the esoteric meaning behind the texts. And I think it was Maimonides who said, look, my dear friend, it's only a fool that takes the Bible literally. So I think within Judaism, there's also the history of all the great prophetic witnesses in the Old Testament, and the patriarchs and Moses, and they point to a definite transpersonal area of experiences. I hope you're beginning to get the picture. I mean, I live in a visionary world. My idea is that sorry?
Could you just say in 2 or 3 sentences what the word transpersonal means?
Okay, beyond the experiences of the individual ego, we all have this level of lived experience. We think, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. We go about our lives, I must do this, whatever. I mean, ego psychology studies all that stuff. And Freud tried to explain how our ego is formed and so on. The transpersonal is with the higher bands of human nature. Okay, so it's with the uppermost levels, which are reached in prayer or meditation or dreams or occult practices or shamanic experience, sometimes through the arts or music, of the sense of being taken out of yourself. We all have those moments of ecstasy. Ecstasy, Greek, means literally being taken out of yourself, standing outside yourself. So, for a generation of the 60s, it was LSD that gave them that experience. And for many people, that was an interdimensional opener, and people like Sting go off and take ayahuasca. That's how they do it. I mean, historically, that's been part of accessing the transpersonal realms in all cultures. In the ancient mysteries of Greece, they used to use substances like that. But you don't need to. I mean, you can do it through prayer, you can do it through the arts and so on. But it's that feeling of life having a deeper meaning. Please, God, let's have this land for us. And so they're very fierce about holding on to it. And it's a very moving narrative. And it's the narrative of Zionism, which was dreamed up by people in the 19th century and when they saw Europe wasn't really liking them very much, when anti-Semitism was on the rise, they saw the Holocaust coming because it was already sort of going on in patches. And the Catholic Church was teaching that you're a Christ killer, and therefore subject to all the karma, negative karma for that. So what on earth are you going to do? So the early Zionists started thinking, well, we need an exit plan. Why don't we ask the Ottoman government if we can have Israel back? That's the early Zionists like Herzl. And there's a whole history of that, which is fascinating. Now, the problem with that narrative, I mean, it's a wonderful narrative, but there's a whole other narrative, a counter-narrative of the Palestinian Israelis, which is that there they were happily in Palestine. It's been their land for over, a very long time. I mean, I've met Palestinians who were early Syrian Christians, probably related to Christ. It's the same people speaking Aramaic that became Syriac. These were the original inhabitants. And before that, they probably all go right back to the earliest people of Canaan who built the first cities of Jericho and, very ancient Neolithic settlements, 8,000 BC. And they're all living there happily. And suddenly these Zionists turn up and take their land. That's their story. And, with the collusion of the victorious powers of World War I, Britain, America, to some extent France, in allowing mass settlement and income from these Jewish settlers. And, suddenly in 1948 they're declaring an independent state. When the British left, the mandate was ended, the Jewish community declared, well, we're going to have an independent state of Israel. Now the Palestinians didn't want that. So they said, no, well, we don't want that. This is Palestine, it's our country. And so there was a battle, there was a war in 1948, the first war, if you will. It's called the War of Independence for Israel, or the first Arab-Israeli war, whichever you want to call it. And the Palestinian stories, it was presaged by the beginning of a definite plan for genocide, which they say was hatched in the Red House in what is now Tel Aviv, by certain forces that were planning ahead for when the British were leaving. They call this the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. That this was a planned genocide, because the Israelis knew that if they wanted their state to be ethnically comprised mostly of Jewish people, they had to get rid of the Palestinians. And so there was a lot of massacres going on. And this war, the invasion by the Arab armies, was a kind of an excuse to institute a plan that was already pre-hatched. So this is what Palestinian historians are saying. And there is evidence for this. This is what even Ilan Pappé, an Israeli historian, is saying. The archives show this. Right? So the Palestinians have really been, their narrative, and I've spoken to Palestinians in their refugee camps in Palestine, Their story is that they're living in a kind of suspended animation. They don't have a home. They can't travel about freely. They can't go to Jerusalem. Like, I've just driven from Argyll to Edinburgh. No police stopped me until the last bit here. You know, I couldn't make that journey to Palestine. You're stopped with roadblocks every few miles, and if you don't have exactly the right stamps and papers, you're sent back. So there's a totally different narrative, a different history. Now, how on earth can these be reconciled? You know, the suicide bomber who feels the pain of his people so much that he's prepared to go to Tel Aviv and blow up a nightclub. You know, his vision of history and suffering is so utterly different from the Israeli Defense Force guy who's going to shoot him if he can possibly prevent that. You know, this is where transpersonal history, I think, can make a difference. Is if the plan is, if we can get the responsible archive keepers, the historians of both sides, it's like they're the memory keepers. In all the ancient tribes, you have a memory keeper. Okay, that's the historian. In the Druid community, some Druids were the memory keepers. If you can get them together to have these discussions like we're beginning to have now, and we can begin to ask, well, okay, so you've got a history of suffering, we've got a history of suffering. You know, well, what about the Kurds? They've got a history of suffering. The poor Kurdish people, they've been clobbered between all the empires. The Turks don't want them, the Iraqis don't want them, the Syrians don't want them. You know, nobody wants them, but they're very proud people going right back to early Zoroastrian roots. What about the Armenians? There's all these little suppressed narrative stories going on in the Middle East. The Armenians, they got the worst suffering of all because they were killed massively by the Ottomans, they say. And they say that was a Holocaust in its own right, a genocide. And I've met an Armenian chap in Bethlehem and interviewed him, who identifies very much with the Palestinian cause, because they're both, in his eyes, oppressed peoples. So, what I'm saying is, in the Middle East, if we can begin to get these different narratives heard, aired, and shared, you know, there's an old saying that a suffering shared is a suffering healed. You know how it is when you go to a doctor with a pain, usually on the way there the pain stops. It's because you're about to share it, I think. and so the pain goes. You know. That's what I think we need to do, is go to the doctor of the Middle East transpersonal history. And this pain, I mean, it's a silly thing, I think, for humanity to go on this journey of who's had the worst pains. Let's also recover the history of joy. Because transpersonal history is mainly and ultimately about joy and creative love and altruism. Because our highest aspiration, don't forget Maslow, is towards the good, towards loving. And as a peace studies scholar, I've come to the view that we need to recreate the history of altruism and the narrative of goodness in human history. Too much of history is the history of wars, violence, genocide, Holocaust, hatred, lies, the whole thing. Let's have a history of truth and love. And that is the most important thing. If you think back on your lives, it's the history of your loves that is the big thing. The love of your parents, siblings, the love of nature, the love of God, whatever it is that you love. That's the thing you're judged on. Okay, so if we can do that, because the people in the Middle East are incredibly joyful, I have immense hope. I'm sharing good news here, folks, you know. It's unbelievable, actually. If you read the Gospel seriously, and you think, how on earth can one guy in 3 years create such an explosion of joy that people were prepared to go, you know, singing up to the lions and go and live on ridiculous cold islands up on the coast of Argyll and get rained on, and yet sing the psalms, you know, and talk to angels. How can anyone have done it? It's because Christ, I think, broke through into this utterly transpersonal sphere of divine love, and he shared it, you know. And I think that is bubbling up. I was in a wonderful kibbutz in Israel just recently, and talking to a Palestinian guy, a Christian, you know, and I could feel this love coming from him. It's still there in the people, and that's why I think we are going to get there. So instead of this narrative, historical narrative of revenge and justice, gevura in Kabbalistic terms, retribution and grief and so we can flip to a creative narrative of kindness and compassion, karuna in Buddhist terms. Right? So we can begin to ask then, what would the implications of the Middle East be like if we factored back in an awakening of consciousness into the Middle East? Right? Because don't forget, transpersonal history is about consciousness. The history of consciousness, if you want. Well, we're seeing it, aren't we? The so-called Arab Spring, but it's not happening fast enough, and it's not happening nicely enough. It happened in Egypt. That was an immense awakening. The Tahrir Square, the way that those demonstrators just prayed at the army, and the armies were melting away. It's not working in Syria, which is very sad, because Syria is an ancient, very wise and wonderful culture. It's where St. Paul found his experience with the numinous, and it's got very ancient roots. I think that, I mean, I'm behind the scenes hoping, we can mediate between the different factions in the Syrian conflict, but ultimately it has to be done on this transpersonal level. Okay. If you factor in the birth of consciousness, what happens? Okay. Let me give you a little sneak preview. I've just written an essay on all this, which is some print thing, and one of the 10 points I make in that is, because I've been very inspired in my own work as a historian and scholar by the Buddhist bodhisattva ideal. My own spiritual journey has been a sort of, I took a Tibetan Vajrayana initiation when I was about 19 as a bodhisattva, which is working for the enlightenment of all humanity. And I've been to Samye Ling many times. I think if we look at history from a Mahayana perspective, which means a great vehicle perspective, right, which is the purpose of the narrative of our lives is to reach enlightenment, which is in freedom from suffering and pain. This is what the Dalai Lama says, it's to reach happiness. But if we don't just want to do that individually, there's no point in me doing that alone, right? And you guys are all still suffering. That's very selfish. We've got to do it together collectively. That's the Mahayana perspective, right? Collective enlightenment. That's embodied in the Lotus Sutra and the great sutras that are carried to Japan and elsewhere by Chinese translators and so on, right? And in Tibet. So, okay, so what I'm arguing is, like Gary Snyder, he uses this wonderful word, Californian Buddhist poet, meta-Mahayana. Now, even Mahayana's not big enough, because that's just another branch of some strange religion called Buddhism, right? Let's talk meta-Mahayana. Each religion is part of the great vehicle of mankind's salvation. Each of these spiritual journeys, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Jewry, whatever, is part of the big plan of spirit to redeem itself from suffering, right? So we can then look at these competing monotheisms. Islam, I'm the only God, I'm Allah. Judaism, no, I'm the only God, I'm Yahweh. Christian, no, I'm the only God, I'm the Trinity. Those battles, as sort of like a childhood nursery thing, which we awaken from. When we were all kids, we used to play with our toys and we'd be cross if somebody took them off us. I'm sure we all did that. It's the same thing. You're taking my monotheistic God, mine's the one, etc. If we mature, transpersonal history requires us to mature to the actual experience behind these stories and narratives, to the actual experience of compassion and love. Then we see, well, wow, fantastic, you've got a wonderful God there. Allah is amazing, incredible, I love Allah. And so is your Trinity. One of the big sad things, by the way, of one of the revelations you get if you study transpersonal history is that not all the prophets had the bigger picture all the time. Some of them were not very well educated. They were not very learned people. And much as I love Muhammad, he's a very wise, immense, incredible soul, he simply did not get the Trinity. He had no training, he'd never heard of St. Paul, he'd never read the Gospels. He knew Christians had them, and it says in the Quran, the Christians have got their Gospels. He seems to think Christ wrote the Gospels, because he keeps saying, and Christ gave them the Gospels. In other words, Muhammad had no knowledge of actual Christian theology at all. And he certainly didn't get the concept of the Trinity. Now, this can only be explained because he'd never met any Christian theologians. And the people he'd met, sort of wandering desert mystics in Syria, had taught him versions of Christian Gnosticism that were going around, which were very anti-Trinitarian. He didn't get the basic fact that the Trinity is a metaphor, largely inspired by Celtic Druid roots, which think in triune symmetries, right? That God is this mystery of like a whirling energy, which, for want of better language description, we call it a Trinity. You know, it's a process, an energy happening. Now, Muhammad didn't get that. So the Quran has this kind of, every now and then it goes into a rant against the Trinity. Now, that's a real problem for transpersonal peacemaking, but transpersonal history, from a meta-Mahayana perspective, can look on that compassionately and say, well, he just didn't get it. Let's just move on. But he can get it now. You see, because the point of view from the sort of meta-Mahayana perspective is these prophets and so on, they go on. They're still around. Just as Christians say the saints are still about in heaven, wherever that is. Well, it's the same with great prophets and sages and teachers. This is the sort of territory that anthroposophy looks at, is accessing the kind of the karmic records of saints and sages after they're dead, and invoking their energy and help now. So all advanced practitioners of esoteric work, that's why Christians invoke saints for healing, and Buddhists do the same, and Sufis do. Transpersonal historians need to do the same. If I'm studying in depth the life and works of Aristotle and spending a year reading his works, I'm going to have to pray to him to get some guidance on what this stuff means. Because after all, we've only got the written text and the notes. We don't have the original talks Aristotle gave. So, right, next point. I just want to mention a couple of things and then throw it for discussion. The first thing is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. I mean, you heard Desmond Tutu saying it was a good idea and being sort of booed off stage. The thing is, I have nothing to lose. I'm nobody. Right? That's why I can do it. I mean, I'm not on any side. I have no axe to grind. I have no professional sort of status to lose. So I've gone amongst people in the Middle East, and I'm still doing it. And now we've got this wonderful tool, the internet, interviewing people, talking to people on all sides of this conflict. And I've set it up, under my institute, which came out of the University of London. Now, it's under the radar. Nobody's thought, thank God, to kind of stop it yet. Because it's totally non-governmental. I can't work with governments. I just don't trust them. They're not transpersonal enough. I quite like the Queen. I quite like the transpersonal dimensions of that. And so I have actually kept informed certain, powers that be. And so far I've been getting away with it. There is an interesting little footnote to that, can I just say, is when I've spoken to Palestinians, they desperately, when they get independence, they want to join the Commonwealth. You may not know that.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I've spoken to people in the Palestinian community at quite high level. The first thing they want to do when they get independence is join the Commonwealth, because they look back on the time when we were there, the Mandate, as actually we were quite honourable people. And they think, quite right, if they join the Commonwealth, they get some backup. We could give them technical expertise, help, training police forces and so on. And back in '95, we had a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting here in Edinburgh at Shoggan. Does anyone remember that? Is anyone here? It's Commonwealth leaders come together once every year in a different part of the Commonwealth. I'm Canadian by birth, right? So I'm a sort of Commonwealth figure. And I came to Edinburgh at New College, and we had a meeting and set up the Commonwealth Interfaith Network. I think at least one person in the audience was there at that meeting. That's where we met. Hello. So, that dimension is important. And to me, my vision is the Commonwealth should be a family of nations so you can peace with each other. That's the spiritual sort of thing I'm doing. And that's what the TRC is about. The final project I want to mention is this Golden Gate project. Now, this is a visionary thing. This came to me last April. I was invited to Israel to give a talk at a conference of light workers and all kinds of esoteric visionaries from all over the place. Israelis and from around the globe. Talking about the esoteric significance of 2012. And is there going to be some kind of great denouement to history? And one thing that's interesting about transpersonal history looks scientifically at the question of the future, sort of apocalyptic history, right? And there's prophetic literature going right back to the Book of Enoch and so on, and the Book of Revelations that talks about the future. Now, if you interpret that scientifically, what those texts are all saying is there will be a flux of noetic self-awakening, of enlightenment. Now there will also be forces that try and resist that, and that try and block it. A lot of this goes back to Zoroaster, who was one of the first prophets we know of to have this kind of narrative going. He talks about the struggle between Ahura Mazda, Lord of Light, and Ahriman, the force of darkness. Ultimately, Ahura Mazda wins, helped by a figure that Zoroaster names as the Saoshat. Right? That's very, very ancient. That idea got into the hands of the Jewish community when they were in exile from the Persians, the Zoroastrians, and they translated it into their language as the Messiah, the Saviour. Okay, and then that in turn got into the Christian narrative because they were all going on saying, where is he? Where is this Messiah? Oh, he's in Galilee, you know. And some people accepted Christ as the Messiah, some didn't. It's a story, a plot line about how history comes to a happy ending, or at least gets happier than it is now. Now, there's a wonderful legend I discovered in Jerusalem that the Golden Gate in the eastern wall of the old city of Jerusalem will only be opened when that Messiah comes back. And when that Messiah comes, then it's opened. Then there will be a time of peace on this planet. And at the moment, it's blocked. It's like filled with breeze blocks. If you technically go around to the wall of Jerusalem, you literally can't get in. It's full of breeze blocks. And I was meditating there and thinking, this is ridiculous. Because outside the gate there are loads of graves where people are buried, Muslims and Jews, because their narrative plotline is that when the Messiah comes, the gate's open. Then there'll be a general resurrection of the dead, and whoever's in the grave closest to the gate will get in first. And what I'm saying with the Golden Gate project is, it's time for mankind to seize the initiative from this waiting period. Instead of kind of waiting for the Messiah, we've got to get on and do it ourselves, because so far as I can tell, he or she isn't actually daring to show up. Although there's this guy, Ben Creme, saying he's been in the East End of London and blah, blah, blah. Ever since like the 80s when I met Ben Creme, I can't wait anymore. You know. So let's get on and do it ourselves.
He's making a living out of it.
Seems to be.
Waiting.
Yeah. So look, so stop waiting. Let's get on and do it ourselves. And there is a field of psychology, dear old transpersonal psychology. There's a wonderful thinker called Bion, who wrote some studies of the messianic consciousness, what that means psychologically. It's when anything new comes into a system. It could be just like a committee. Do you know that thing of being co-opted onto a committee and you have a new idea? And they all look at you like, where did you come from? Get him out of here. You know. That's what Bion calls the eruption of the messianic consciousness. Anything new that comes into an old staid system, then it gets rejected, which is what happened to the Christ story. And it happens again and again. I think today in Edinburgh City Council there was a vote as to whether they should charge for spontaneous free events. I hope it was thrown off, you know, because committees dream up all kinds of nonsense. But anyway, so that's what I'm suggesting. If we open that Golden Gate, I'd like to do it on December 21st later this year, but it might be a bit of a tight schedule. I don't care when, as long as it's soon. My vision is that the world's interfaith leaders could come in together arm in arm, right? So it's quite a wide gate. You know that wonderful march of Martin Luther King and all these people arm in arm going down the road? Why can't we get, you know, the world's leading religions arm in arm coming through the gate together, symbolically saying, well, we actually want peace on this planet. You know, the messianic consciousness, which is what Jung and Wilber and transpersonal psychology has told us is embedded in all of us. It's what Krishnamurti said, of course. You know, and the implications of that would be like a bit of theatre. You know, let's open the gate, have a bit of interfaith theatre, and then people can go on the mount there to like a peace tent and do their prayers in an interfaith kind of way. Now, you know, there are all kinds of complications politically as to get that project through, which I'm working on. And, you know, there's a talk which has been filmed, which you can hear about this. I mean, I've only had time to skate over these projects. There's a lot of thought gone into them. They're designed to kind of open up that positive energy for the planet. Meanwhile, stage left, we've got Iran and Israel beginning to make stirring noises about possible preemptive strikes against nuclear weapons and so on. We've got Ireland causing trouble, to put it metaphysically around. Now, my argument about this, if anyone wants the real details, I can email you the text of my 10-point peace plan for the Middle East, right, which is kind of the final print. But one thing we do need to do is to kind of have in-depth discussion between religious leaders and theologians about the kind of narrative that history's got to lead up to an apocalyptic struggle and a war. One of the things, I can't go into huge detail, is we need a very serious and intelligent discussion about the role of the devil in history. Because both sides are saying the other guys are the devil. And this diabolization of the other is a problem. Now, Zoroastrianism invented or created, conjured the notion of the devil, Ahriman. Now, it's a very interesting self-justificatory thing for your imperial invasion of Greece, if you can call the Greeks devil worshippers, which is what the Zoroastrians did. I think we have to take the devil out of history and put a human face back on him, and it's just you and me, folks. Right? So, in a nutshell. But, and that was what Jung was trying to say about the image of the devil. So, we also need educators to be involved in this dialogue. School teachers, I've worked in schools as well as universities. I love school teachers. They are the saints of the planet, I tell you. Why can't the school teachers of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Iran just, come together and have conferences on education for peace? Why can't they? And why can't our government fund that kind of thing to be happening instead of thinking, I know what we'll do, we'll go and drop bombs? How stupid is that? If we had funded, or if we could now start funding peace and development in the Middle East, the trillions of dollars we've thrown into militarising the Middle East over the last 20 years is really an insult to human intelligence. And we in the West have a responsibility to get our morality right, I think, which means supporting educational work, interfaith work, and peace work. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I hope I've said enough to cause a few, ripples. And any questions or discussions? Thank you very much.
Well, I'll just take up one or two themes and then we'll throw it open for discussion. I was particularly interested in the sort of competing narratives and the history of suffering and therefore the justification of perpetuation of narrative and conflict that inevitably comes out of this and the way it culminates in this apocalyptic vision that is shared through all three monotheisms and how that actually also impacts on American foreign policy and what's happening in the Middle East. Some of the policies are being pursued, which is really on the assumption that we can bring it about. This apocalypse, which is incredibly dangerous.
A bit stupid.
I know, but that is the sort of more extremist use of the narrative, and that's transpersonal in the sense that it's the end of history, so far as these narratives
be the rapture.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
The Republicans will all go to heaven.
And so that's something. So that's one theme that we could look at. Another theme that I'd be interested in your views on is the Aldous Huxley sort of solution in inverted commas to the human condition, which is you referred to the use of entheogens, the sacred mushrooms and so on, or whatever the tradition of doing this in different cultures. So Huxley felt that the use of soma in Ireland was one way of a sort of peaceful revolution. And of course, this doesn't address any political aspects, which he addressed in a different book, his book Ends and Means, as well as his other visionary work. As you say, you've raised a huge number of other issues. One other issue I think is worth highlighting is the narrowness of interpretation that you were pointing out, where we've got the history of economics and material conditions, not looking at so much the consciousness which produced these conditions, and the narrative, the personal narrative, the inner strivings, well, that's a very good phrase to use, that constitute the essence of our own personal histories. And to the extent that one is interested, and I'm certainly interested in this, in the history of ideas, then ideas are embodied by people or in people. And when you embody an idea, it can have a good effect or not such a good effect, depending on the mix of ideas and what the political expression of those is. So let's throw it open for discussion. I think there's another microphone, is that right? Yes, going round. So who'd like to enter the fray? Not the right phrase. Yes. And just perhaps give your name.
Yeah. Hi, Gareth Davis. When you speak about the transpersonal experience, and when you want to talk about praying to Aristotle, you did preface it by saying that you're coming from, or it comes from this anthroposophical view of the cosmos, if you like. When you actually engage in debates with historians of the regular kind, I suppose you realise you're involving them in a great big paradigm shift. Okay, so that's really it. We're making a big move intellectually anyway to get people to know what you're even talking about and will accept it. But, therefore, it would seem that people need to undergo this change in consciousness to even understand what you're talking about. And therefore I'm picking up on the fact that the arts and other non-psychotropic substances, if you like, can produce this kind of experience for people. It's kind of a shame really that in churches we're trying to get into this experience with singing of hymns and what have you, but I think we fail to get there. We try a bit harder, if you like, but it's along those lines we have this history of worshipping and getting into the ecstatic mode of being, if you like. But it seems to have fizzled out along the way. And now there's this big intellectual shift we have to make of the anthroposophical kind, taking the testimony of Steiner and others, psychics, of experiences. So that seems to be the substance of what you're saying. We have to have this experience before we can accept these history of ideas shift there.
I love your accent, by the way. I lived in Wales for 10 years. Brilliant. Yes, and I learned a lot in Wales. You're right. I mean, I have talked a lot to, normal historians. I would like to think I'm also a normal historian myself, okay? Whatever that means. And I would say two things. Firstly, in the history of Western rationalism and philosophical discourse, of which historiography is a fundamental part, right, there always was a mystical route through reason. I think one of the problems of the Scottish Enlightenment, of dear old Hume, I hope you're listening, was a misunderstanding of what reason is. Hume didn't get it. He didn't see that, well, I don't think he got it, that sheer pure rationalism is itself a mystical experience. Right? The logos is what Kant talks about, the cause of transcendental freedom. It's because we have access to the logos that we are spiritual beings. So it's not, to me, an either-or thing. Either I'm rational or I'm a sort of wacky mystic that takes mushrooms. No, we can get to truth through using actual reason in the authentic sense of what the Western philosophical heritage is about. I mean, that's why I bothered to do it as a PhD, because I wanted to prove that within the system, that's where the waking up is needed. And if you go back to the history of higher education in Britain, the people that founded the University of Oxford were God-intoxicated mystics. People that founded the academy in Greece, or Aristotle's Lyceum, these people were in love with truth so much, they wouldn't they wouldn't allow their minds to be deflected by other stuff than pure truth. And I can tell you, it's pure, sheer reason of that kind is like a mystical experience. Now, what's interesting, in the Middle East, there's a wonderful philosophical heritage there. In Islam, the greatest Islamic philosophers used Aristotle as a guide to translating and understanding the Quran. The current rector of the University of Al-Quds in Jerusalem is an expert on Aristotle in Islam. So these people realize that Muhammad's mysticism can be explained within a framework that, in their day, Aristotle was the most advanced psychology around, right? Because he invented this discipline of psychology. Transpersonal psychology has grown out of Aristotle's love of noetic experience. So the shift I'm actually arguing for is a return to our authentic intellectual roots and heritage. It's not becoming wacky and, it's becoming authentically what we are, which ought to be, inheritors of the incredible lineage that we've inherited from Western thought, which ironically a lot of it came from Eastern thought. If you go back to the history of Greek philosophy, a lot of it was seeded by Phoenicia and Eastern sources. So anyway, yes. Thank you.
Can I just add something there? Do you know Peter Kingsley's work?
Yeah, absolutely. I love it.
Yeah. So his argument, his argument is we should go back to Parmenides rather than Plato. And Parmenides was an initiate, and who had mystical experience. And he expressed this, talked about the oneness of being, and so this is a different vision.
Yeah, that's the authentic stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I just made an amazing discovery actually. I came across a book in Glasgow just a few days ago of Karl Popper's, who was a great philosopher of science, and I heard Popper's last lecture at the LSE when I was a student there, before he died. And in the last couple of years before his death, he wrote a book about the pre-Socratics and about Parmenides. Popper also loved the pre-Socratics, and he said we should go back to Parmenides as well. Not many people know that.
No, I do have that book. Actually.
Okay.
I can revisit it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the same lineage. Parmenides was a priest of Apollo, an initiate in Apollo, but so was Aristotle. Right? Aristotle was a healer, and Pythagoras as well. Pythagoras was a healer first and foremost, and so was Aristotle. That's why we use the word doctor, meaning a teacher or a healer. And to me, that's what we should be doing. All our academics should be working as intellectual healers. That's the point of studying all these ologies, after all. Next question.
It's not necessarily a question so much as a follow-through on what I've been listening to. There may be a question. But this is about the relationship between breathing and walking and thinking and experiencing joy. And if what we're wanting to do is to experience the joy of knowing, the joy of listening to one another, of finding commonality, it's my view that there are actually millions of us now. And the difficulty is actually finding the way through. With all of us together, sharing worldwide, that it's like the Occupy movement isn't about people who want battles. It's about people who want justice to be loving, not war-based. And that somehow or other, we've moved as a race from being people who want to hit one another over the head with clubs, to being people who want to love one another's children no matter what world they're living in, and who don't want the Amazon destroyed for profit. And we're all here. So how can we raise the roof and make it happen? New, Thomas, okay?
Thank you so much for that statement. That reminds me, one of the ways we can do it is through language. Confucius said, the sage readjusts the terms people use. Right? And one of the projects I've directed to about today is write a dictionary of philosophical terminology in all different languages. Right? Because as a philosopher of language, the problem on the planet is also that we don't understand each other's languages. Right? And people misuse language all the time. So the very first thing I've done as an intellectual historian is write a dictionary of language using Sanskrit, Hebrew, Pali, Arabic, Tibetan, Chinese, Gaelic, etc. Now, the word terrorism has always been a problem to me. I don't like terrorism, and I don't like what it does. And I see this as a linguistic challenge. I'm linguistically challenged about terrorism. Right? Bombs going off, people thinking intellectually that by causing suffering and grief, I'm going to get my political way. I think that is an error of a metaphysical and an ethical categories. So I've coined a new word, which is joyism, which is the antidote to terrorism. And what you're talking about is joyism, right? Which is very similar. A lot of the Occupy movement, they're doing it.